Hello everybody, I'm Tim Cooper from National Parks at Night, and today I want to talk to you about using Adobe Lightroom's HDR to make better low light and night photography images. But before we do that, I want to take a moment to subscribe below so that you'll be the first to see when our videos come out. All right, let's jump right in. So for those of you who may not know what HDR is it stands for High Dynamic Range. And what that means is in many situations, and as you can see here, both in dim light and in urban nighttime environment, what we have is a situation in which the film or the digital sensor may not be able to capture the full range of detail. So the contrast is just too high. So for example, if we look at this image here, the highlights are blown out while the shadows look good. And if we look at this one, the highlights look really nice, but the shadows are just too darn dark and we can't see too much information in there. So HDR stands for High Dynamic Range, and the process of shooting for HDR means you encounter a scene that has too much contrast, so you take multiple exposures. And you can see here I took 3 exposures, and this one was good for the highlights, this was the middle exposure, and this is the brightest exposure, and this one's good for the shadows. These are about a stop apart. You can shoot these images from 1 stop apart to 2 stops apart. But the important thing is that when you're shooting out in the field, you want to ensure that the sequence that you take, and that could be 2 images, it could be 3 images, it could be 4, 5, 6, 7. The number doesn't matter. It just matters that the sequence contains images that are the same distance apart, either 1 or 2 stops, and the sequence also contains the images that contain good highlight detail and images that have good shadow detail. So that's how I photographed these 3 images. Now, this is a shot in Bruges, and this is very typical of a nighttime urban environment in that you have very bright light on the building. We have a little bit of skylight. It's not quite pitch black yet, just a little bit of light there. But we have areas that are quite dark, and they're not showing detail. So I decided that I was going to shoot this to process as HDR. Now, what I want to show you today is Adobe Lightroom's HDR program. There's many out there. I like this one quite a bit. I also like Photomatix quite a bit, but today we'll be demonstrating Adobe Lightroom. And the way that we're going to blend these images together is quite simple. All we'll need to do is select the 3 images. And while you're in your library mode, you can go up to Photo, Edit In is where you would normally go to Photoshop. But today we're going to go to Photo Merge, and we're going to go to HDR. Now, before we get there, let me just say that when we blend these 3 images together, and you can see these are CR2s, so these are an old Canon, some old Canon images that I made. They're going to blend together into a brand new document, a brand new file. And it's going to also be a raw image that we'll be able to manipulate in Lightroom without risking any damage. So at this point, there's no real reason to go into the develop module and do individual adjustments. I do individual adjustments on some images when I'm using different HDR programs. But with Lightroom, the only individual adjustment you need to make is to go into the lens corrections and choose Remove Chromatic Aberrations and Enable Profile Corrections. Adobe recommends this for their Merge to Panorama, and so I also use this for the Merge to HDR. So once you change that on one image, you can see down here that the 3 of 3 image is the most selected, or meaning the active image, and the other 2 are also selected. So when I hit Sync, what I'll do is I'll choose Check All, and then all of these items, all of these different adjustments will be synced. So we hit Synchronize, and now each one of these images will have the chromatic aberration checked and the Enable Profile Corrections checked, which is good. That's what we want to do. So we'll return to the library mode and go up to Photo, Photo Merge, HDR, and we get this very, very simple box and very easy to use window. First, we're going to want to check Auto Align. And this means if you bumped your tripod in between shots, it will help auto align them and make them all register perfectly. Auto settings I don't choose, simply because I find that the auto settings are usually not what I would choose. If you want to choose that, you can. All that simply means is when you're back in the develop module, there's an auto settings checkbox that you can use. And it's the same as whether you check it here or whether you check it there. It doesn't matter. So you can turn that on or off after the fact. Okay, so I'm going to leave that off. Now, the next checkbox is create stack. And that simply means that when you get back into Lightroom, you've got your 3 images and they're sitting side by side. If you put them in the stack, they would all underlie each other and be in one. You'd only see one image on top, and you'd have a number 3 saying there's 3 of 3 images in the stack. So by creating a stack, the HDR image, when we get back to Lightroom, will be on top, and the other ones will be nested below it in a stack. And I'll show you there. I'll show you that when we get back there. Okay. The deghosting. In this image, we can choose none because there is no ghosting. And ghosting would be something like if somebody was walking through the frame and they appeared here on the first image, here on the second image, and here on the third image. Why, when you blended the images all together, they would be partially transparent here, partially transparent here, and partially transparent here. That would be ghosting. So the act of deghosting is removing that. And what Adobe does is it picks one of those images and says, this is the one we will use. And then you'll only see one person right here, and the person here and here are disappeared, and you're just seeing the pavement behind it. It's kind of Adobe doesn't do the best job with deghosting. I far prefer Photomatics for that. But in this case, for this simple image with no deghosting, it's not a problem whatsoever. So to recap, all we did was we selected those 3 images and chose Photo Merge HDR. This box pops up. Once you choose Auto Align, that's sticky. It'll always be sticky. And you just say, is there any ghosting in here? No? Okay, we click None, and then you hit Merge. And once they're merged together, you can see they've been brought back into a stack, and we can tell that's a stack by seeing this number 4 up here, which tells us there's 4 images. If you click on that, you see all the images in the stack. If you click on it again, it collapses the stack. So right now, the HDR image, we can see it's the HDR image because this one says -HDR-2, and this one says CR2, CR2, CR2. So this is our HDR image. So what we'll do is we'll go over to the Develop module and look at how to develop this. Now, the biggest problem most people do is they think, well, the highlights are too bright and the shadows are too dark. So we lower the highlights and increase the shadows, and we've got our image. The only problem with doing that is it leaves us with sort of a false look to the image. So a better approach is to, let me reset these by double-clicking on the word highlights and double-clicking on the word shadows. The better approach is to begin with your exposure and highlights. So we can see our highlights are blown out here by our little white triangle, and we can see the little thing here. If you click on your highlight slider and hold down your Alt key, you'll also see what's blown out. Anywhere that's showing that's not black is blown out, and you can reduce that until they all go away. That's kind of a cool method, but sometimes that'll leave you with an overly dark image. So right now, this seems pretty dark to me. And with my highlight slider, I think I'd prefer it to look like that, even though when I press my Alt key, I can see, oh yeah, this is blown out, that's blown out, and that's blown out. Well, those are light sources. And in this urban type of environment, when we have light sources, we don't have to worry about those in particular blowing out. It's completely fine. I just don't want to lose detail in this building face. So remember, we can use the science of Lightroom, but we also have to use the heart and the creativity of ourselves by looking at the actual image. So I'm going to bring this back up knowing that it's blowing out my urban lights, and that doesn't bother me at all. So what I'm really looking at is these lights right here. Now the next step is to bring up your exposure. So as you bring up your exposure, you're also going to lighten up your shadows and the overall look of the image. This gives us a more realistic look rather than just increasing the shadows. Now, of course, as I bring up my exposure, my highlights start to blow out again. So while I'm using this exposure slider, what I'm really thinking of is looking at the overall feel of the image. How bright is the sky? How bright is the pavement that's not in the shadow? How bright is this building? So on and so forth. And that to me looks okay for now. So now I'll return to my highlights and bring them back down a little bit until they look good. All right, now that leaves us with our shadows. We can still bring them up a little bit, but we won't need to bring them up as much as we did before. And then we can turn to our blacks and bring them down to anchor and ensure that there's a good dark black in that image. And you can see I'm kind of crushing the blacks here, but that's okay because it is a nighttime photograph. And so, we expect there to be some pure black. And now overall this image may feel a little bright to me, so I'll go back and bring my exposure down just a touch to make it feel more like night. That's looking good. Now I might be able to bring my highlights up a little bit, and often what I'll do is double click inside this box and use my up and down arrow keys rather than the slider to be just a little bit more accurate and go in smaller increments. And now maybe just a touch more on the shadows. Nope, I think I'm going to leave the shadows where they are, and the blacks are good. They're a bit crushed, but that's okay. And our image is processed, and it looks fairly realistic. So we can use HDR, of course, when we're out in the field and shooting Milky Ways and star trails and other things like that. But it really does come in handy when we're doing that urban night photography. Another place that it comes in handy is when you're simply in low light. And let's look at these three images that were taken in Barcelona, which is a place that we're visiting this coming November for a workshop. And we not only shoot out in the streets at night for urban, but we also go into the museums and all the incredible cathedrals. And in those situations, the light is really, really low. And so we have to use all of our nighttime techniques, thinking about ISO, whether or not we can use a tripod. And so we're using all that same skill set. In this particular image, this is Sagrada de la Familia, and it's one of Gaudi's incredible structures. It's a cathedral that's been being built for I don't know how many years, but it's crazy, beautiful. The problem is it's really super contrasty. So when I take an image like this that's really good for my shadow detail, my highlights are all blown out. So when I go to look at all the intricate detail up in the ceiling, it's gone. In order to get that, I've got to use a much smaller or a much shorter shutter speed, and now we can see that detail up in there. So for this, I shot at 1,250th of a second. And for the shadow one, I shot at 1/80th. So these were three different exposures at 2 stops apart. And what I didn't do was just put it on auto bracket and pray. What I did was I took some test exposures first, made sure my highlight detail looked good, and then I discovered this shutter speed here. And then I thought, okay, I'm just going to open up and shoot again. And I opened up and shot again until I determined that an 1/80th of a second looked good for my shadows. And then I took the 1/80th of a second and the 1/1250th of a second and said, oh, okay, so if I shoot 2 stops apart, I can make 3 images. And that will give me the highlights, a middle image, and then one that's good for my shadows. And that's the way I determined the 3 shots for that. Now, in many museums and in buildings in the larger cities, you're not going to be able to use a tripod. So I actually had to handhold this. So I had to calculate what were handholdable exposures versus how low I could keep my ISO to keep the grain structure really nice. And but also I was unable to use a tripod, so I had to handhold. So in this case, in addition to considering my exposures beforehand, what I did was then put the camera into burst mode or high frame rate mode and auto bracketing in high frame rate mode. And then I just held my camera really steady, got my composition, and click, click, click. And that's going to be a much better way to go rather than individually taking one shot, click, and then adjusting the exposure and clicking again, adjusting. We don't want to do that. So we want to have our camera all set up and ready to go, steady ourselves and shoot. And you can see that as steady as I tried to be, there's still some differences in these images. You can see that they're not perfectly aligned. And this will show you how good Adobe does at aligning the images. Once again, I did go down and in the develop module, chose remove chromatic aberrations. And I also checked enable profile corrections. All right, so I return to our library mode here. Let's go to our grid. And we've got these three images selected. So once again, we're going to go to Photo, Photo Merge, HDR. And again, we don't have any ghosting in here, so we can choose none. It's going to be auto align, which we want. Create stack, that's fine. So all we have to do is simply hit merge. And once again, we return to Lightroom, and it's automatically stacked. So we click on that. We can see our three RAFs, which are Fuji files. And this is our DNG, HDR-2 DNG. So we're going to go to our develop module. And once again, the image is a little bit dark, a little bit flat, so it's time to develop it. So as a reminder, this HDR image is a combination of all those three images and all the data that comprises them. So it's no surprise that when we get an image straight back from the HDR program, it's not going to look exactly correct. Now, had you chosen auto settings inside the HDR window, that would basically be hitting this button right here, this auto button. It would come back looking like this with all of these sliders already changed. As I'd said, I don't always find that this works for me. So I would double click the word tone, reset it, and do it manually. Much like the last image, it's a little bit dark and we're not seeing detail on our highlights, so we're going to remedy that. In this case, what I might do is just start with my highlights and bring them down until I start seeing detail in here and in here, and then increase the exposure until maybe that detail starts to disappear or the image looks good. Now it's starting to look like the proper brightness. This place is just filled with light and beautiful color, and so I want to bring that out. I don't want this to be a dark sort of feeling. So we can look at our windows and look at our detail in here and see that we do have some detail. Maybe I'll bring my highlights down just a touch more to bring some out in there, so we're seeing all that. But now the increase in the exposure has really brightened up the overall image. I might be able to take that up a touch more if I wanted, depending on the feel that you want from the image. Bring your highlights down a little bit more to bring some detail back. But the important thing here is we, once again, want to decrease our blacks. If we look at our histogram, it's just touching the bottom of that file. And it being a dark place, or when we're working with night images, it's not uncommon to have our blacks crushed a little bit here. But don't just look at the histogram. We also really need to look at the feel of the image to make sure that we're getting the impression that we want. All right, so that looks pretty good. And once again, as a reminder, you might want to consider increasing a little bit of contrast, because sometimes that contrast is lost once we go to HDR. So that's adding some local contrast in here. Now I feel that looks pretty good. A couple issues left though. The center part of the photograph in here, where I really want you looking around this light source, still feels dark. So in that case, we can take a little radial filter and kind of just draw a circle from here on out and then lighten that up with a little increase in exposure. And right now that's happening on the outside rather than the inside. So what I'm going to want to do is hit invert. Now that's lightening up on the inside where I want. Let's bring it back down to 0. Just want to brighten that up just a touch. We don't want it to compete with the other light sources in there. And we're going to want to add some contrast in there too, so it's not quite so flat. And now if you look at the before and after, you can see how, you can see how you've lightened up that center without it being really obvious, and it just adds a little more depth into the photograph. Now the last thing I'm going to do with this, which is really common with urban landscapes at night, or interiors, especially of churches and cathedrals and museums and things like that, is we're going to go down and look at our transform. So as best as I could do hand holding this, I tried to set this up as square as possible, but it's not quite perfect. We can see that the columns are off a little bit on the right and left. This part of the church is leaning down this way. So what we can do is we could try these auto and level and verticals, but a good choice is often guided. And what guided asks you to do is draw the lines you want to make straight. So when you're dealing with architectural, typically the line in the center should always be straight. You're never going to straighten these lines out because they're always having that convergence from looking nearly straight up in this case. but the lines going up in the center should be straight. And we could see that this line here goes right through this line, which should come down and basically come through somewhere in the center down here. Now notice when I put my mouse over this, I can actually get a little enhanced detail view. So I want to put my cursor right there in the center, and I'm going to click and then draw up. And as I draw up, the line comes out, and I want to realign it with another straight line up here, another center of that window. All right, now that's the one angle. Now the next angle is going to be the sideways angle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here and try to straighten this out because that's the most visually important. So I'm going to get close to this window here and go along that frame. And I'm looking at the magnified version here on the screen. And I'm going to go to the right, go over to the other window, and draw that down until I get to that line right there in the center. And once it's aligned over the center, I unclick and it automatically straightens out both of those lines. So now you can see this line is straightened and that line is straightened. Now it's going to look quite a bit better. The last thing we're going to do is go up and we're going to do a little crop because these columns are now off somewhat. You can see this one's going out of the frame and this one is still within the frame. So I'm just going to grab from the top and even those out so that we have a fairly even and very symmetrical image. And there you have it. All right. So folks, working with HDR is actually quite easy. The trick is simply to ensure that you get the proper exposures out in the field. And remember, you can do a little testing first. You don't have to do it all while you're actually making the images, but take a few test shots. Make sure you got some good highlights. Make sure you got some good shadow detail. And make sure you find out those numbers and set your camera to capture those images in 1 or 2 stop increments. Get her back into Lightroom, select the images that you want, and simply go up to Photo, Photo Merge, HDR, and the rest is quite simple. We're going to align them automatically, bring them back into Lightroom, and develop them in the way that I just showed you. Well, everybody, thanks so much for watching. We really appreciate it, and I hope you all found that helpful. We always welcome constructive feedback, so if you want, take a moment and write a comment in the section below. And while you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe. You might also consider going to our website, nationalparksatnight.com/blog, to sign up for our blog posts, which are weekly things that we put out that are awesome, very educational, usually a ton of fun and really helpful. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you all next time.